Welcome back, everybody. Um, Emily O'Brien from Duke University and DCRI is going to talk about designing for cumulative precision. Um, Emily?
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily O'Brien. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm just so energized by Frank's really masterful and practical take homes for considerations and questions that we should be asking when designing a study. So, really excited to kind of build off of that. For this talk, I want to go really one level above. Maybe where Frank was focused, which was really on kind of individual trial decisions and kind of how those affect the types of evidence that we generate. And really, the argument that I want to make is simple, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, and I think one that we've heard many times before. But I think it's time to kind of bring this into the modern era and think about what we all collectively can do to change it. Um, the basic argument is really that the evidence generation system that we all work in is broken. And importantly, I don't think any one of us is to blame. Certainly, the institutions that we work for are not individually to blame. But we're really working in this system that doesn't focus on cumulative evidence generation over time. The good news is this is, in my view, largely due to the way that the system is designed. And because systems are designed, they can also be redesigned. And so I want to challenge us to take a step back and ask ourselves what it would look like to treat evidence generation as a more coordinated and longitudinal system that I think we actually have some really nice examples to point to motivate us. So many of you may have heard of Garrett Hardin's classic concept of the tragedy of the commons, which I think is a really nice representation of where we are in clinical research. And our version of this concept is that, again, as investigators, as methodologists, as trialists, as statisticians, even as funders, we're all acting rationally, sort of making sensible decisions in our own individual context. But those decisions, when they aggregate and accumulate over time, result in overall adverse outcomes for the discipline as a whole, including things like duplication and fragmentation, and ultimately progress that's just too slow and not relevant, and not at the level of relevance that it should be to really help patients. And so the central argument here, again, is that it's not that any one of us is doing anything wrong. We're being incentivized for behaviors that can have long-term adverse impacts on the system, and that the stakes here are really real. People are, enrolled in studies that may not meaningfully contribute to the longitudinal knowledge base. The evidence that we do have is underused, and it takes us a lot longer to get to answers that actually change clinical practice and improve outcomes for patients. And so we really need to treat this as what it is, which is a system problem if we want to make change. So this is a classic sort of like epi framework for approaching, problem like this that's fairly complex, which is, understand, first of all, descriptively, where are we? When we look around, what do we see? What are the signals that are meaningful, and what do those tell us about where we can improve? To think about etiology, what are the drivers? Moving into more of like a causal inference framework. Why are we where we are? And then to think about points of intervention. What are some of the structural shifts that we might try to push forward in order to build a more healthy system? So I want to start with where we are, and I'll ground us in sort of a few concrete examples before we move to causes and solutions. So just to kind of set the stage, when we think about where we are and where we might want to go, it's fairly stark contrast between what I see as a fairly fragmented system, limited visibility into where the knowledge gaps are, and no real accountability for cumulative evidence by any one actor within the system. On the right, we have what I would say is at least a few components of kind of the ideal vision, which would be a system where we have trials that are informed by some sort of shared evidence map that we all have access to, and that our process is really one of sequential learning across studies, and that we're sort of over time moving to an increasingly precise estimate of any quantity that we might find, of interest that patients might say is important, et cetera. I think the key point here is that this isn't a technical impossibility, and it's not, some idealistic fantasy. This is a design choice that we could make and that we just haven't made yet. But I'm hopeful that we will make smaller choices that lead to this in the future. So I first of all wanted to share, a few examples. They're fairly dated at this point, but I have one recent one that I want to point you to as well, to kind of show what this kind of failure, if we want to call it that, looks like in practice, and how it can adversely affect the communities that we're working to generate evidence for. Many of you may be familiar with the streptokinase story. And this is a really fascinating one that happened over about 30 years, from 1959 to 1988. For this treatment, there were 33 separate RCTs conducted evaluating effects on acute MI. There was evidence of a significant mortality benefit after just 8 of these were done by 1973. And so we have 25 trials that were done after that, with 34,000 additional patients who were enrolled, when essentially, we were already aware of the answer in terms of mortality benefit. And so this is the kind of delay that is, of course, bad for science in terms of wasted resources and duplication, but also bad for people who are enrolled into studies that really didn't change the way that we understood the effects on mortality risk. We're not erring in just one direction. The lidocaine story sort of shows the mirror image of this. This was a therapy that was widely used prophylactically in MI for years. But the cumulative evidence, when people finally looked at it as a whole, showed that there was an excess mortality risk with this treatment. And so when you think about not reacting quickly enough to the signal, and then also on the flip side with streptokinase, not responding sort of quickly enough to the observed benefit, you can sort of see that there's this common root failure for both. That we're looking at failures of a system that doesn't really treat evidence as cumulative. So I said those were some big historical kind of failures that will hopefully motivate us to do things differently. It has been several decades, and so you might ask the question, have we learned from our mistakes? And unfortunately, the answer is not really. So this is the high-level view of results from a Cochrane review, or an assessment of a Cochrane review for 39 trials registered after 2015. That were performed after evidence was rated as already being high certainty. And so we have a question that was, sort of already answered. Trials were done anyway. And so, we still see this sort of problem with duplication and lack of sort of visibility or willingness to devote resources elsewhere once we already have reasonable confidence about the answer to the question. So the reframe here is that, we talk a lot about failures of a system, like there's some sort of, bugs or oversights. Maybe people aren't doing science as rigorously as they should be. But I really see these as features of a system that is, working the way that it was designed. It's optimized for the wrong outcomes, and it's going to take more than just asking people to do things better and do things differently individually if we want to produce long-term and comprehensive change. Okay, so let's take a quick look under the hood and think about, why this is happening and the various contributors. Most people have heard of the file drawer problem, which, is maybe getting a bit better with time. We're, all familiar with some really great initiatives toward open science. But, there's still this issue of really human behavior and human psychology, driving this filtering that happens, where, we see publication of positive results and sort of minimization or abandonment of what we might think of as null results or negative trials. And this, of course, has big downstream consequences for meta-analyses and systematic reviews that ultimately are built on a biased literature and then sort of propagate that through the aggregation and synthesis of those studies. A lot of this is due to what I would call misaligned incentives, and this is an oversimplification, but when we think about things that we can do as a scientific community that really help society, help population health, some of them are kind of boring. They're things that people don't get too excited about during study section or proposal review. Things like replication and synthesis and sharing data, reporting null results. These are things that the system doesn't quite reward, or it rewards less than maybe it should, because it is heavily focused on things like positive findings, publications, first mover advantages, et cetera. And so there's this sort of inherent almost penalty. I mean, we're all working on lots of different things. The funding environment is increasingly constrained and there's limited time. And so it's hard to make an argument for the individual scientist to go and really push some of these things forward when there's no incentive on the system side. I know this team is really familiar with, new efforts around infrastructure, which I think are really, really positive and sort of future looking and forward looking, and we'll talk about a few of those examples later on. But really, there are some infrastructure gaps that I think are kind of critical investments that need to be made before we can sort of realize this vision of cumulative evidence synthesis and a more longitudinal view of our work over time. It's been, really interesting to see kind of the evolution of this vision of the learning health system over time, and kind of see some of the things that come up, in the sort of day to day. I think that there's still a lot of optimism about that, ultimately that vision becoming a reality, but as some of the sort of infrastructure barriers, I think, have limited some of its progress so far. As Frank mentioned, I think that there are a few statistical and regulatory frameworks issues that really have stymied progress in this area. We have a regulatory and statistical infrastructure that was really built for a different era, where you had a single trial, a single p-value, single approval decision that was sort of the end of the story for given therapy. We're still very much anchored in this sort of binary thinking, and have really built a system that kind of treats that binary result as a final verdict instead of just one input into an ongoing learning process. And there's some good reasons for this. I think funders especially are pretty interested in studies that are conclusive, as opposed to just generating evidence that contributes to a larger knowledge base. But that's where I think we as investigators can really, commit to some of the best practices with respect to pre-specification and publication, even if things, maybe don't turn out quite how we planned it, or would prefer that they did during the data analysis stage. So none of these are really new problems. We've known about them. We've talked about them for decades. And there's sort of this question of why are they still with us? And I would say the answer is none of the incentives have really changed, right? There's no real penalty for publishing null results. Promotion and tenure still depend on the same old stuff, novelty, grant funding. Reviewers, when we go into study section, we're still sort of excited by the novel kind of proposals, and sort of less enthused maybe by things that focus on replication and synthesis. And again, the regulatory paradigms that were really designed for kind of single indication decisions in the 70s, those require a lot of sort of cross-agency consensus to change. And, we're seeing a little bit of movement with that, as Frank mentioned, that we can talk about, but I think we still have a long way to go. And then finally, underneath all of this, it's really that nobody in the clinical research chain is responsible for this sort of cumulative cross-trial answer to any given question. Not the investigator, not the funders, IRBs, certainly not journals, and not regulators. And so as long as we have, no single entity that really holds accountability for, healthy and comprehensive evidence generation, we're still going to continue to generate fragmented and duplicative knowledge. Okay, so let's talk about some solutions, and hopefully we all believe that we can and should move toward a more functional system that accumulates high quality evidence over time, and doesn't misuse resources. As I said at the start, the system that we're in right now is a result of design choices, and the failures are not laws of nature. They're the outputs of structures that we built, and we can rebuild those structures. We can change them, and I think that we have some real reason for optimism. I don't spend a lot of time in particle physics, but it is pointed to in some of the meta science literature as one very nice example of longitudinal evidence generation, as sort of working proof of concept that we could try to model ourselves after a bit. And it's an interesting field to kind of read about, because they do have this culture of preserving data, reusing it, incorporating measurement updates into this like shared global estimate, and really focusing on sort of resolving contradictions within the field instead of ignoring them. and not treating any single experiment as definitive. So the goal in that field is really, reduce uncertainty over time, not expect every single experiment to be the final answer on any given question. So I have a few shifts here. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the discussion about whether you think these would actually change anything or if you have ideas. But ultimately, this is going to have to be a partnership between changes that we make it on an individual level and changes that are made at an institutional level. But I do want to talk about two that can begin today. And I think could help us move to a more functional system that optimizes for really, portfolio level precision and then coordinated uncertainty reduction across studies. This one's an easy one. I hope we can do this today and continue to socialize this so that we really make a change in how we talk about the results from trials. Language matters way more often than I think we acknowledge. The way that we talk about trial results carries a lot of social weight, and it shapes the way that science is funded and communicated and pursued. Negative trial, even neutral trial, I mean, those are pretty deep, I would say, deeply misleading terms and harmful to our efforts to accumulate evidence over time. I think tomorrow, if we all decided to call so-called negative trials inconclusive or imprecise, that would go a long way toward thinking about how everything that we do can contribute to a larger movement toward uncertainty reduction over time. And it may seem like a semantic distinction, but I think it really does influence whether the scientific community treats questions as closed or open. And I think that has important implications for the directions that our science goes in the future. This requires a shift in practice from funders and study sections and journals. Funders really, I think, could do a lot to adopt practices that focus on, funding proposals that reduce genuine uncertainty, not just studies that are, well positioned to generate so-called wins or losses. If, as study section members, we can ask, is this powered to detect an effect? Are we meaningfully reducing uncertainty that matters? And we've seen a lot of movements from journals to incorporate presentation of things like confidence intervals or cumulative confidence interval estimates alongside single trial results. But really, I think overall it's not moving quite fast enough, and there should be I would say kind of outright rejection of any presentation of results that rely on a single p-value, which I would say is really incomplete data. There are a lot of people and a lot of components of the system that I think can contribute positively to this movement toward cumulative evidence generation. In terms of making prior evidence a requirement for things like IRB applications, funding applications, I'm not convinced that this will happen anytime soon, but I do think that ethics committees could go a long way toward moving this forward by requiring some sort of evidence of systematic review of the literature, so that we know that people are not being enrolled in a study that has already for a question that has already essentially been addressed. On the funder side, same issue. Not a ton of optimism that this will change overnight, but I'd like to see us move toward rewarding work that completes evidence portfolios and not just sort of first mover studies. And then really a change in philosophy that, as we score proposals and think about the contribution to science more broadly, thinking about reducing residual uncertainty instead of only, studies that are framed as answering a question definitively. So the good news is there's been a lot of movement toward producing tools to illustrate shared uncertainty and using things like network meta-analyses and databases of systematic reviews and primary studies, as Epistemonicos has done. I think with the advent of AI, it's possible that we see more movement in this space, and as programming and sort of dashboard generation become a little bit more accessible for people who are not software developers, maybe we'll see some nice movement toward creating publicly accessible displays for the current evidence state across various clinical domains. I think we'll get there eventually. I think the technology is there. It's just, incentivizing, the right people to go out and to do that, to make sure that we have a good sense of where the important questions are and where we have, pretty good evidence, and don't necessarily need a ton more investment in terms of resources. So as Frank mentioned, the FDA draft guidance released in January 2026, I think does is a really nice step forward in terms of pointing to the really the option of using Bayesian methods for primary inference for regulatory decisions, and laying out some of the guardrails, if you will, or recommendations for how to incorporate data from prior trials, and kind of how to be transparent about the priors, and justifying those appropriately. I will say, sometimes this discussion about cumulative evidence generation kind of devolves into a frequentist versus Bayesian discussion, which I think is part of it. But I would also argue that in some ways this is independent from any one method that you might choose. It's really about a philosophy of wanting to contribute to this healthy longitudinal evidence generation system that treats every study as an important data point that can be incorporated into into our thinking about a given question. I'm very, very much in agreement with what Frank pointed to as an estimation first mentality with precision-based planning. It's been interesting to see in the epi community, I would say some radical views on this, which I know we're not all totally on board with. That, like, you never need to do a power analysis for an observational study, because if you are already investing that level of analytic effort and resources, that you just do the study, and even if it's an imprecise estimate, you can publish that, and that can become part of some hypothetical meta-analysis in the future. I think there's some practical constraints to that thinking, but I like the idea that instead of focusing on this sort of crossing some arbitrary p-value threshold, that the goal is to reduce uncertainty. And if we are certain that the study that we're conducting is going to be kind of like the only answer on a given clinical question, maybe we come up with a way to think about the results as being more definitive if the confidence interval no longer spans some range of clinically meaningful ambiguity, for example. And so the question really moves from how, did we reject the null, to how precisely do we know the answer now? And this, I think, would change a lot about how we design studies and interpret results. Just a couple of rules for this estimation first playbook, and I think it's actually pretty simple, that we're designing around precision rather than yes or no rejection. And it's been great to see the movement with more thinking about pre-specifying estimates as opposed to nulls. And then being transparent about the uncertainties. And if we all did this, I think we'd see a lot of movement in the culture of how we conduct and report research. I think there are also nice benefits overall, both for our own work as well as to science more broadly, that again, we're moving toward framing inconclusive results as contributions, even if they were not in line with the traditional reject or fail to reject paradigm that we've all been taught. And ultimately, this requires an identity shift away from this idea of declaring winners and losers to characterizing uncertainty. And I like this framing of not being the significance police, but uncertainty engineers. So this is a hard one, and I know there may be some folks on the call who might have some ownership of infrastructure development, but we really are going to need investment in infrastructure to enable this longitudinal learning. Things like having shared control arms and continuous enrollment, adaptive learning, and some examples that came up in COVID that I'll touch on briefly, that really show that this coordination does outperform fragmentation. And some of the other sort of pragmatic trial discussions that I've heard, it's this concept of moving away from these small crappy trials toward more conclusive answers, which I think is positive overall. But ultimately, still allowing for the idea that not every single study that we do needs to be conclusive, but we need to be good stewards of our resources and make sure that we're not duplicating in terms of the infrastructure investment. Recovery, I think most folks are aware of as a nice example of moving from novelty at all costs to building on what we know. And embedding, randomized assessment within clinical care, and we saw, amazing reduction in time from trial results to implementation of findings during the pandemic. Some of the the discussions that I've been part of so far are like, well, it's nice to think about the pandemic era because there's so many resources and so many people who are excited about doing this work. There's a lot of motivation that maybe isn't there in our sort of post-pandemic phase and sort of day-to-day life. But there are some nice examples that I think show that it is possible even outside of that domain. Stampede is one example, multi-arm, multi-stage platform trial for advanced prostate cancer that has been around for about 20 years that does have this central coordination and reusable infrastructure and sort of ongoing and continuous learning as part of its evidence generation process. Remap Cap is another nice example of an adaptive platform that was developed before COVID happened and used a sort of really innovative modular domain structure to allow simultaneous evaluation of various approaches for community-acquired pneumonia. And it was a great example of building something that was then ready when COVID arrived, and we could bring to bear to answer some pressing questions at the time. And then finally, I think there's an ethical shift that we need as much as sort of methodological shift. And that's to be honest about the fact that when people enroll in trials that are not well coordinated or that duplicate questions that have already been addressed by existing evidence, there's a real cost in terms of risk and inconvenience and time, and the system and other patients don't receive much benefit from that. And so we tend to think of this sort of like ethical obligation in the context of our single study. And if we can broaden that and think about our ethical ledger as a community that should reflect what every trial actually contributes, and that patient participation is really a resource of our community as a whole and not necessarily of any single trial on its own. So we really have this sort of cross portfolio obligation to make sure that we're deploying this resource wisely. It's hard to change systems. This is a common question that people bring up. I would say that the answer is oversimplified, of course, but it's humbling and empowering to think about that we really are the system. There is no system outside of the investigators and the trial teams, the funders, the editors, the reviewers, ethicists, regulators. When we change how we design studies, how we report results, how we interact with reviewers, how we interact with editors, how we review papers, that's a powerful bottom-up practice that can help to move the needle, so to speak, and reinforce norms one way or the other. And so I would just encourage you as you go throughout your regular professional life, your projects and your other professional commitments, through things like reviewing and editing, et cetera, to keep this in mind that you are a part of the system and your voice does matter. And every activity that public activity that we have does help to either reinforce norms or reshape them toward sort of a better vision. So I'll just close by saying that our current system is the product of an outdated design, but it is not inevitable. We've already shown through several examples, both within the pandemic period as well as outside of that, that we can do things differently. And our challenge now is really to learn from those examples and to scale what works, to embed it in our own institutions and our own interactions as scientists, and to sort of carry it into our mentorship and training as well. So I do think it's possible to build this more functional and healthy longitudinal system for evidence generation. And given what's at stake, I think this is a real imperative for us going forward. So I will stop there and happy to take any questions.
Great, Emily. Thank you very much. That was even more thought-provoking than it was advertised to be. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Cecilia, do you want to bring those forward, and then we'll we'll look uh, we'll look have an open discussion.
Sure. So the first one here from Anusha is how do we ensure emerging evidence is synthesized early enough to detect harm? And if you'd like to open it, Emily, it's the Q&A on your Zoom
Oh, got
bar.
it. Yes, I was not.
No worries, especially while you're sharing the screen, that's easy to miss, but if you'd like to read it as
Emerging
well.
evidence is synthesized early enough to detect harm. Okay, is this in the context of? Sorry, could you say just a little bit more about that?
Anusha, if you'd like to unmute, you're welcome to.
Hi, Emily. I'm Anusha. So, you're mentioning about the cumulative evidence and how better we can use for the trials or any research, even longitudinal study or prospective observational study. So, how do we ensure that that emerging evidence is synthesized enough to detect a study which we want to run successfully, but based upon the emerging evidence, do we have now in capacity to determine the trial might run successfully or it might fail?
So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk a little bit about smart trials, and I think there's good so increasing support and openness to some of the responsive and like adaptive randomization designs where you do have fewer people who are sort of assigned over time to arms that are sort of worst performing, and ultimately you can set thresholds to drop those arms when safety signals emerge. uh, I'd be curious if Frank or others have thoughts about that. Is that the context that you're talking about?
I
Yeah,
think so. I think she may also be talking about the context of cumulative safety evidence. You made some arguments about cumulative efficacy. Uh,
Yeah,
Is Frank still here? I think he is.
I'm still here, but I don't have anything bright to say about that.
Well, I do, Frank, because I remembered what you've done. You've forgotten more things that you've done than the rest of us. You put together a very nice cumulative safety program that allowed for comparison across trials. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's the kind of cross-trial type resource that I heard Emily talking about. You want to tell us a little bit about that tool?
Well, it was a combined DSMB type of report for multiple ongoing trials that are related. And I think it's a good case study about the obstacles we have to face because the excitement level for study leaders of these different studies to be sharing results was less than impressive.
Yes, I was tasked with selling Frank's very good longitudinal tool, Emily and Anusha. And Frank is being polite. Less than receptive is a very polite word. What we heard was, um, you want me to share my data with another trial going on at the same time? What the blank are you thinking?
yeah,
Uh,
that sounds like a structural barrier.
yes, yes. But we were naive enough to try to do this in real time during the COVID pandemic. And I think you made the point, and I think that's what Anusha's asking, but we'll go back to her now. You made the point that there needs to be some structural investments in being able to share data, whether it's efficacy data or safety data. I think that's your point, is it not?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the timing does matter, right? When something's already published and you're uh, getting ready for data repository, that you sort of post-trial, post-study kind of efforts. That's a slightly different scenario than when the study is ongoing. Is that the one that you all were that's the period that you all were focused on, Dan?
Yeah.
Other ongoing work, yeah.
Yeah, and that was part of the hard sell. But
Mhm.
flip it around the other way, okay? In COVID time, we both wanted to reject things that were unsafe, and we heard lots of speculation but not data on it. Um, and so time could be important for safety as well. And we'd have such a tool if we worked on it now. Right, Frank? I'm pretty
Sorry, had a
I'd
glitch
be
here.
curious. Yeah, I mean, maybe you all can talk about this. I mean, was the concern from the investigators who were unwilling to share around like scooping themselves, or I mean, it's hard to really see what, like, if it's a safety signal, what like what I it's
I think
do you know what their psychology was?
part of it was a fear of an earnest evaluation by unbiased people of the efficacy signal.
Okay.
Yes. I think there was another barrier that I heard distinctly when some of the statisticians in the trial that I was managing heard about this. They go, "Well, that's extra effort. I didn't plan on that. You want me to do what? I have to, manage an extra data set." And we told them, "No, we're going to do all of that for you." But so there was both the workload
Hmm.
and the loss of control.
Yeah, some fear of data security.
Yeah. Well, and
Well,
when you ask a question, why do you not want to do something? You often get an ambassadorial answer, not the true answer.
I think we do a pretty poor job when it comes to data sharing of articulating the benefit, and people tend to only see the headache and the time cost. And that's why, you ask people about data sharing, at least, in my group, there's this sort of eye rolling of like, we have to, send our stuff to these repositories and nobody ever uses it. Part of it is, I think, a cultural issue of, us maybe not. I think it's just a total like mismatch between what we see as the potential benefit um, to us, and then like potential benefit to the scientific community as a whole and to patients as a whole, and not really being able to follow the thread all the way from that headache to, oh, this is something that could actually help patients. I'm surprised by the COVID example, because I would think it'd be fairly easy to say, hey, we're going to keep randomizing people into arms that may not be optimal. If we have more safety data, we'll be able to stop doing that. And there's sort of, at least theoretically, a direct and clear, obvious, immediate benefit to reducing the risk of harm. And I would think for most people that should be a nice antidote to the concerns about effort and headache. But I guess if it's too theoretical, maybe it's not enough.
And Frank wasn't requiring any decision making about arms. It was just sharing the point estimates and confidence intervals
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
safety events to better inform um, um, safety assessments.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anusha, does this answer your question?
Yes, Dan. So I was more coming from the clinical trials perspective, Emily, like how best, like when designing the clinical trial, to use this cumulative evidence. So we do have this meta-analysis and systemic review results for any trial, and we can look at the literature and come up when designing the trial. But like when you mention about this cumulative evidence, and I wanted to understand how better we can use for clinical trials, for designing the clinical trials.
Well, it sounds like you're doing the right thing. I mean, I would say, if you are incorporating past evidence, the more that you do that, the more precise and accurate your estimates will be of, anticipated safety events and, what you might expect in your new study. So I mean, that seems like the right approach.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there other questions out there? Cecilia, do we have any others?
Anusha, I know you'd put in a second question. I wasn't sure, if you kind of got that answered in this
Yeah.
discussion.
No, Cecilia. So, Emily, I have one more question. So you mentioned about like when proposing a research study to the grant to the funders to get its approval, we should focus on minimizing the uncertainty. So there are like many factors which account for uncertainty in different therapeutic domains. So like how we address reducing the uncertainty when designing the study.
Let me
Yeah.
jump in for 1 second. One of the things that Emily said was using the cumulative evidence, which was your other question, Anusha, to help define what the uncertainty is at the time that you're developing, planning, beginning your next trial. I think that's what I heard you say, Emily.
Yes. And that is, I would say, somewhat a grantsmanship skill. And, the other part of it is convincing people that that uncertainty right now is making things worse for patients. And if we were to reduce that uncertainty by some magnitude, that would result in better decision making and better outcomes. So it's a bit of a dance, but I think overall the recommendation would be to move outside of we're going to detect this effect to right now, our sense of how effective or safe this therapy is, or whatever other quantity we're estimating, it's messy. We're not really, we can't say for sure what it is, and we need to do more work to have a more precise view of what that estimate is. And here's how that will help us. So that's not something that I guess I've seen a bit more of it recently, but most grants are not written that way, at least in my experience.
Okay, thank you.